Hey guys, Claire here with Clarity Nutrition. I'm here to tell you today a little bit more about the difference between whole and processed foods. What's the difference? What are examples? How do you break it down? Is rice, which technically is a processed food, the same as Twinkies? Gonna break it all down for you today. So a couple weeks ago, I made a post about whole and processed foods. And for me, it's pretty self-explanatory because I do this for a living, but I realize for some of you guys, it's probably not 100% clear. So I wanted to answer all of the questions that came up about whole and processed foods. And the biggest one that was apparent with most of the people sending me messages and DMs about the difference is technically there are some processed foods that could be considered as whole foods. To be a quote unquote whole food, by definition, it's undergone no degree of processing. So you're thinking like eggplant that came from the ground, or like a potato that hasn't undergone any processing at all. It's raw, completely, everything like that. If it undergoes anything that changes its basic composition from when it came from the ground, it has been processed. So I mean, technically speaking, if you roast sweet potatoes, that is a degree of processing. If you take chicken breast off the chicken, you take off the fur and you make it a little bit safer to eat and you package it and you sell it, that technically is a degree of processing. But we don't want to compare, a chicken that has been made safe for you to eat but is still full, jam-packed full of nutrients and minerals and vitamins and everything like that. We don't want to compare that to Twinkies. So I have preached to you guys to eat an 80-20 lifestyle. 80% of your diet is coming from whole foods, 20% is coming from processed foods. And when I say that, I am talking that 20% of processed foods is going to be our maximally processed foods. That 80% of whole foods is going to come from both whole food ingredients that undergone no degree of processing. It's also going to include all of our minimally processed foods. So it's probably undergone 1 to 2, not many more than that, degrees of processing, and it's going to resemble, for the most part, its original form. So that brings me into kind of definition lesson type stuff. So there's 2 types of processed foods. There's minimally processed and maximally processed foods. The minimally processed foods are things that pretty much resemble where it came from, whether it is a protein source or coming from the ground. This is going to include a lot of the proteins that we eat, some of the vegetables, like especially cooked vegetables, or anything that has been packaged just for convenience. So like frozen vegetables, for example, or canned fruits and vegetables, whole natural nut butters. Natural almond butter has undergone processing. It does not resemble an almond at all. Things like peanut butter and stuff like that, but it's just ground up and made into a butter form. We're talking natural ones, not necessarily like Jiffy. Jiffy I would put more in the maximally processed food category. But minimally processed foods, they've undergone maybe 1 to 2 degrees of processing, and some of it's either out of convenience or for safety. So you can't, have a chicken that's straight off the chicken breast that's straight off the chicken, or a cut of meat or ground meat, for example. It does undergo a little bit of processing, but all the nutrients are pretty much there. You can tell where it came from. You can identify the source. It's also going to include some of our grains and starches. So I would say that whole grain bread, or like Ezekiel bread that has, like, you can see the sprouts and you kind of see the breakdown of it. No, it does not mimic 100% its original source, but it is very minimally processed. Also, like oats, those are going to be minimally processed foods. Again, you can kind of tell where it came from, and it does resemble its original source without all of the butter. Like popcorn, for example, it came from the kernels. It went under just the heating process to pop out of the kernel. So hopefully that is a little bit clearer. I also like to say, kind of, you can count ingredients. So if to be a minimally processed foods, I would say that it has less than 7 ingredients, and most of those ingredients you can pronounce. If you cannot pronounce it, if it has more than 7, it is likely a maximally processed food. And you just go to the nutrition label. I made a post about it a while ago. I had these beet chips that I got from Trader Joe's, and there were 4 ingredients. It was beet, salt, oil. So it had 3 things. I can identify all 3 things. I can pronounce all 3 of them. And it just underwent the roasting process to make into a chip form. It didn't have, sodium biglycinate or anything like that, like something that you probably can't pronounce unless you studied chemistry for 4 years in college. So that's the kind of definition of a minimally processed food. Maximally processed foods, those are the big processed foods that I talk about. And I say that you should limit in your diet. And these have undergone more than 1 or 2 degrees of processing. It likely doesn't resemble its original form. And it has greater than 10 ingredients. So you take ice cream for an example. Yes, we all know that kind of ice cream comes from milk, but it doesn't resemble its original form at all. You can also pull up the ingredients, and there is a large list of ingredients in there. Pizza, that is another one. Twinkies, a lot of our baked goods, you know what the ingredients are, but it is a lot, and it doesn't resemble its original form. It's not like, roasted nuts are minimally processed because they have been roasted with some seasonings. I wouldn't compare that to a Twinkie, which I don't know what's in a Twinkie and what makes up Twinkies. I don't think anyone really does. So maximally processed foods, they've got ingredients you can't pronounce. It's a long list, usually greater than 10, and it 100% does not resemble its original form. So we're going to think, baked goods, meal replacement bars, those have a ton of ingredients in them and chemicals to help with the preservation process. Baked goods, candies, microwavable dinners, things like that. That's going to be our processed foods and maximally processed foods. Frozen waffles or like even Kodiak cakes, all of that does not resemble its original form, has more than 10-ish ingredients. Those are going to be maximally processed foods. And when I say to have an 80-20 lifestyle where you're eating 80% whole foods and 20% processed foods, I am combining the minimally processed foods and the whole foods into one category, simply out of being realistic. It is very unrealistic to expect everyone to eat raw vegetables that have undergone no degree of processing. 1, it's pretty hard to do, and 2, it just doesn't make a sustainable diet at all. And when you cook things, yes, you do sort of lose a little bit of nutrients, but that is to be expected. Same thing with like our proteins. The processing that most of the proteins, especially if you're eating grass-fed or organic proteins or pasture-raised proteins, and eggs and everything like that, the processing that has been applied to those foods are actually for your benefit. It's making sure that there's no E. coli or salmonella present in those sources. So it's actually good for you. It's not a processing to preserve the food to increase shelf life or make it taste better. I used to love cookie dough bites because I would always go to the movie theater. My sister and I would always get cookie dough bites, and they were delicious. And I found out that I had a issue with gluten, and I looked at the ingredient list. It made me kind of aware, so I looked at the ingredient list for cookie dough bites, which has the word cookie dough. So you would think that there's like gluten, like something that would resemble cookies or cookie dough, and it's all sugar. 100%. It isn't processed in a facility with gluten, but it itself, when I looked, 7 or 8 years ago, does not have gluten in cookie dough bites. This is pretty similar. So that 100% does not resemble cookies or anything like that. It is 100% sugar just to make the taste somewhat cookie-esque like. So when I'm saying have whole foods, I'm talking about those minimally processed and whole food sources. When I say processed, I'm talking about the things that don't resemble its original form, that have undergone a larger degree of processing to either increase the taste or increase the shelf life. But it is not it's a fine line. It's not black and white. There's, definitely some gray in there. So if you are eating foods that you don't know if it's minimally or maximally processed or a whole food, you're not sure if you should include it in the 80 or the 20%, shoot me a message. Happy to clear all of that stuff up. So hopefully you guys found this informative. If you have any questions, shoot me a message. Happy to answer any of them. Other than that, have a great weekend.